All right, let me know if you're hearing everything, if you're seeing everything. Drop me a comment and let me know if sound and image is good. And we'll get things rolling. Hey, Tim from Germany. Hope it's not too late. Yeah, let me know that you're here, and I've got some specific topics to start out with. I've got some questions that came in on the forum, some really good ones, so I'm looking forward to getting into that. Hey, Robert. So I'll give everybody just a couple more minutes if more people are going to show up. Hey, George, Ben, Gerardine, and Blue Max. Awesome. Glad you guys are here. So I did something live for Trifecta last night, and with my usual promotional aplomb, I forgot to let anybody know that it was happening. But we did this live stream. It was more about jazz blues and playing the changes. So I did this live thing with Tim Lurch and Frank Vignola. It wasn't like I got to hang out with them because we had to do it sequentially. But I'm all warmed up in Streamland. Weird. Streaming is the worst. Okay, so we've got the tune, and the way that we've been working on it is just been as the tune itself. There hasn't been an intro, there hasn't been an ending or anything like that. So I'm going to start with that. And in the kind of just the rough demo I made of what to do, I did an intro that just kind of sat on a C7 chord, and that's definitely one way you can do it. And remember, it's a straight eighths feel, so this is a little bit out of character, but one of the things I wanted to do with this rag was not do something that was like super ragtimey. Well, just something that wasn't like literally like every other guitar rag on the planet. And so the tune itself has a little bit more of a classic piano rag feel with the straight eighths. And then for the intro, I had done something else with the straight eighths feel that was sort of more modern than a rag. So it was kind of back and forth. But I just took a C7 chord and then was keeping the thumb going. Just taking this tritone sound and then just killing time on C7. Get into the tune. And doing so basically sitting on C and then doing a chromatic walk down from C to B7 to B flat down to A. There are other things you could do, but the idea of sort of establishing that we're in the key of C at first is one way to do it. Another way is to tag the ending. And you don't have to play the ending literally. You could just take the chords and you could make it as out of time or as dramatic as you wanted. You know, you could, you know, starting with. And I'm just trying to make a little melody out of the top note. You know, like that. You could also play more in time, like, you know. So the idea of tagging the ending to make the intro is a really common one, and it's a pretty easy move to make because you already know the ending if you've been working through the embellished version. If you're just playing through a cycle of playing more like an 8-bar rag, just playing. More of the Blind Boy Fuller way of looking at it just as an 8-bar tune, then you could still use those kinds of tunes, those kind of chords to get you into the tune, or you could just do and then right, so you're just playing 2, 5, or in this case I played 7th with a sharp 5, and then landed on a C, just to kind of set it up out of time. And again, you could do that in time as well as playing it out of time. You could play it. And you're into the tune. So in that case, you're playing the 2 chord, D7, the 5 chord, G7, C, G, C. And that kind of sets you up. It sets up. The whole trick here is to kind of set up like that we're in C, so that when you start off on the A7, your ear doesn't hear it as we're in A, but it hears it as something weird has happened. How are we going to get back to C? Which is kind of what the premise of that rag form is. So that's just a couple thoughts about the intro. Once you get into the tune, of course, you've got this whole 16-bar form, which is what all the sort of fundamental and embellished lessons are about. And so then it gets into the question of, well, what can we do in the midst of the tune to sort of arrange it and draw it out? And so there's a few different things that you can try besides improvising, right? So there's a whole set of improvisation exercises, and we can talk about that some more if you've got questions about it. The main thing that I had suggested was to sort of weave your improvisations in and around fragments of the tune. So there were examples where you were doing. So that you've got this play back and forth between the actual tune and the improvising. And then, of course, you can sort of let that slowly morph into a complete improvisation. And we can talk more about improvisation this hour, too. The one thing I would say is that even though this tune may seem kind of hairy, it's full of nothing but chords that you play on all the time. A7, if you play blues in A or blues in E, then you know what to do with an A7 chord. Ditto for a D7 if you're playing. You can look at these first two bars as like a straight eighths version of playing blues in A. So any licks that you know that work on A blues work here. And then G7 going over to C. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but you know, going from G7 to C is something that you do all the time on tunes in C. Right? So if you know any licks for G, then you can get from G to C. So it's just another way of breaking it down and looking at it is to think of this as just A to D7, that's like playing 1 to 4, kind of. And then G to C, that's kind of like playing 5 to 1 in the key of C. So it's just ways to try to make those chords feel less exotic and more familiar to you as you go through the tune. But let me just talk a little bit about some more structured arranging things rather than the improvising things that are covered in some of the material already. And the main idea is there's two things. One is the idea of doing some kind of shout chorus, some kind of arranged chordal-based thing. And then the other is doing stop time, which is an idea that lets you do more single note lines. So we've talked in other lessons about the shout chorus, but there are a couple things specifically here to think about. And the first one is to think about something called the common tone, which means are there notes that you can keep in common from one chord to the next and use that as some kind of connection between the different chords you're playing. So if we start with the high E string, that's the 5th of the A7. And then it's the 9th of the D7 chord, or of the D9 chord. It's the 13 of the G7 chord. And it's the 3rd of the C chord when you get back there. It's the same note we're letting ring out. We can take advantage of that, and you can play a more chordal-based kind of finger picking by using index, middle, and ring on the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st strings, and pick with the thumb, and start by just doing a downbeat where you're going to grab thumb and index, middle, and ring. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So you start on the A7, I guess. Just on 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm just grabbing top 3 strings and keeping the thumb going. And then you can try to do something more rhythmic, like, and putting that against the thumb, which is still doing the same thing. And so you could work out what that is. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. So very syncopated, right? So here's pinch, 2 and pinch and 4 and 1 and. So you just work that rhythm out. Put it on the next chord. Next chord. So that's the beginning of a shout. And then what if you change one note? I got that at the end. Chord, then do it again on the G chord. Now we have sort of some shape to it. Maybe leave a little room in you're taking this common tone, but you're doing a little bit of stuff to it. Now you could also try a different note, like this one. We're going to probably get into some trouble pretty quickly, but we could try this on top of the A7. It's going to be a little weird there, so we've got to bring it down a half step to the top of the D7 chord. We could go back at the G chord, and we could keep it on top of the C. So now we could do something between those two notes, like if we have this, like so we're using both common tones and only changing the G to the F sharp when we have to. But that's one approach. Another way, when you see this happening, you could think, well, what happens if I keep going? And then you get into the idea of a guide tone line, a line that sort of that helps spell out the chord by moving in one direction, preferably chromatically as you go. So with the G on top, with the F sharp on top, with the F natural on top, with the open E on top. So and of course you could do little embellishments with the melody note that you're carrying. So happening, but the melody has a logic to it. It's still following the guide tone line inside. And you could also start to let go of that sort of chordal thing, and you could roll the chords a little bit. So I'm just basically taking the chord at the beginning and then rolling through index, middle, and ring. So 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and. Like that. And so that's all kind of focused on the first 4 bars, first 8 bars. Yeah, 8 bars. And I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit because I see Johnny F is here, and he had a specific question about making the last 4 bars sound less formulaic, right? And the chords are going by quicker, and it's kind of a handful for the left hand. So, but you can apply some of these same ideas by looking at what's on top. So first, what's the common tone? Can we do? So, well, immediately we're going to run out of space here. But what if we start on G? What if we put the 9 on top? Now we have to bail out for the F sharp. Go back to the G here and go there. So we could take the same idea combine the common tone for the first 2 bars with the guide tone line for the next 2 bars. And of course, all the different things we just did. We can embellish the melody. So or you can try to sort of subvert it. Like it does have this kind of descending thing, and maybe that's what sounds kind of formulaic or corny. So now I'm looking specifically for the guide tone line. Can I go up? I'm just trying to make it as chromatic as possible. Those are some of the kind of signposts, right? You want to look for common tones on top, you want to look for guide tone lines on top, and then whatever kind of voicing you grab, there's some meaning to it. There's some sort of direction or some purpose to what you're doing. If you grab common tones, you can do rhythmic things. If you grab guide tone lines, you can do more linear things, and you can start to sort of combine those two things and get all kinds of different results. So that's a little bit about that. And then I want to talk endings, but before I do, since we're still kind of in the middle of the tune, let's talk about stop time. So stop time is supposedly an invention of Louis Armstrong's, probably more so like something he perfected than invented. But it's the idea that the band plays hits or stops, and then there's an improvisation in the gap to get you to the next chord. So right, and it's super dramatic because things stop. And it also allows you to play single note licks that might not be possible to coordinate over the alternating thumb, right? Because the sky is kind of the limit. You're going to hit the downbeat. And even if you don't have a vocabulary that's that elaborate yet, you can do really cool, simple things with the stop time idea. And so I'm just pulling out little bits of the chord and little bits of arpeggio, chord tones, connecting things up chromatically, just doing little things that will help to spell out the sound of the chord without necessarily being a particularly elaborate improvisation idea. But if you have the chops, then the sky's the limit as far as coming up with things that will fill in that space. So I can easily talk about stop time in greater detail, but I want to talk a little bit about the ending and then get into some questions, both some ones that I got from the forum and then, if we have time, like other ones that are coming in now. So, and I'll take a pass through the tune also before questions, just kind of using some of these things that I've been talking about. So for an ending, kind of like the introduction, a tag is often the simplest and most effective way to end the tune. So you're coming around. That's it. You just repeat the last 4 bars. You could now do something that's a little bit more. You could do like a variation the second time or the last time around. You know, so if you're coming from the melody, right? And so I'm doing just like I'm not even doing the alternating thumb so much. Just doing like a big rhythmic thing. Like if you imagine like a whole ensemble where like suddenly everybody's playing the melody and they're playing the same, or they're playing chords in the same rhythmic unison, right? So the thumb's got the same rhythm that's happening on top. So right, so you're coming out of the melody. Bit of stop time there at the end, you know, just grabbing the chord, and you could do more stop time than that too. You know, I mean, you can sort of drag it out as much as you want, but again, once you get into that kind of, if you get into something that's kind of like a shout chorus with the consistent rhythm, when all the picking hand, all the picking fingers are doing the same thing, you have a little more liberty to move up the neck to grab whole chords. And you could combine it with however, in that case, I'm doing the tag, and then when I get to the C, taking it back around again with an A7, D7, kind of what I talked about for the intro. 2 chord, 5 chord, 1, 6. You can go around as many times as you want, and then double it. Turnaround, and I mean, you know, you can make the ending as elaborate as you want. At a certain point, it starts to sound a little ridiculous, but you have options, basically. So those are some of the main arranging things I wanted to present. Let me try to play through a few choruses using some of that. And oh, good. Look at all you folks. Richard, good to see you. Cliff, Johnny, John, and Brian. Welcome, guys. Let me, while I'm playing through a pass of the tune using some of these arranging ideas, like I said, I've got some questions already that I'm going to get to. But if you have more about some of those things that I just talked about, then you can post them as well. So here we go. So that's just some of that stuff in context. Okay, so let me get to some of these questions. James, good to see you. Because there were several things that showed up, and they were all good. Stream quality still good? Sound still good? Oh, right, I forget that there's that delay. So I'm already thinking like questions should be showing up, and I look up and I see I'm still playing. Okay. All right, first question from Ben K. And there was nice. There was some back and forth on this because Ben had a good question, and then I saw that Michael S. Sort of jumped in and gave the answer I would have given. So I love when that happens. But his question was, how come during the in the chart in the tab for the tune itself, I wrote out everything as 13ths and 9ths, and then when I got to the improvisation exercises, I wrote out the chord symbols using 7ths. So how come when we're doing this, I was writing it as an A13, but then when we got to the exercise where it was, I only wrote the chord symbol as a 7th. And Michael actually had the right answer, which is basically the 13th and the 9th are notes you add on top of the basic 7th chord. And in this case, I guess it was an A9 chord that I wrote down, not an A13, but we've got the A7 chord. But then the open B in here, B is the 9th. And if you have a 9th in addition to a 7th chord, then you call the chord, in this case, A9. But when we go to do the improvising, it's still fundamentally an A7 chord. And so when you're improvising, we don't know if you're going to put the 9th on top or the 13th on top. What we do know is that telling you it's a 7th chord gives you the basic architecture of the chord, and you may choose to put a 9th or a 13 on top. But that's just you as the improviser expressing a quality that's available. It doesn't mean that the underlying chords necessarily have to be played with that chord as well. You can put a 9th or a 13th on top of a 7th chord, but you don't have to. So when you go to do the improvising, the basic quality of the chord is A7. It's got a major third and a flat 7. It gives it that quality. If you add a 9 on top of it, no problem, but it's still basically an A7 chord, and you're choosing to put some colors on top of it. So that's the basic idea. When I write out the tune, I try to, especially one like this that's so heavily based on chord shapes, I try to make sure that the chord symbols really express what's under your hands. But then when I go to write out the improvisation exercises, again, I try to just let the chords reflect what notes are actually going on in the exercise. So if you're playing this, yeah, you could write that it's D9, but just because you're holding that in this shape and improvising, putting this note on top does make it the sound of a D9, but you don't have to play it. You might just choose to play notes only up as far as the root. So I hope that clarifies that. And so there was that one, which I thought was really good. And then Tim had a question, which was muting versus ringing open strings, and the transition from using open melody notes to, I guess, to fretted notes, right? So I guess, I know you're here, Tim, so correct me if I've got this wrong, but the melodies got all these open ringy notes. And that's sort of the whole shtick of the piece. And then say here, we're into much more of a closed fretted note kind of thing. So I guess the idea is, and I'm not sure if this answers your question, so again, chime in if I'm missing this. These notes are ringing out, but it's almost sort of written in a way that there are some fretted notes involved as well, and the idea is to get it to sound as much like a melody as possible. That's really the melody as opposed to all of this business down here, right? And some of it is the rhythmic emphasis, right? If I played it with no rhythmic accenting, it sounds more like just kind of a bunch of arpeggios. But if I... that gives it a little more kick and a little more definition. The trick is when you get down here, not having too much contrast in the quality. And so basically you just still want to get everything to be you want everything to still kind of sustain and ring out as much as possible so that it feels like it's of a piece with the earlier part that has the notes that are overlapping and ringing out. So anything you can do to keep those both ringing out. I mean, I know it's basically like, it's just, that's the tricky part of those chords, is they're a handful. You know, there's a lot to grab, and on top of it now you're trying to make them sustain and ring out as long as possible. So I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, but the idea is basically try to get as much rhythmic shape and definition, melodic definition out of the open stringed parts as possible, and then try to get as much sustain out of the more fretted notes as possible. So hopefully that kind of answers that question. And I see there's some new questions coming in. I will be getting to those. Oh, this one I'm going to hold for a little bit because it's kind of open-ended. Okay, a question from Paul about how to play or coordinate the pull-offs and pinches in improv exercise number 1, bar 2. So I have to actually check and see what that is. I pulled it up before. Exercise number 1, bar 2. Oh, okay. Improvisation exercise number 1, bar 2. So we've got... yes, okay. Yeah. So this is a good example of a lick you would play down in closed position, down in open position, to start to improvise. And it just uses stuff that's sitting in open position. Interestingly, using the flat 3 to go up to major 3 and flat 3 to go down to 2. So... So this is something that actually I was just recording the exercises for next month's lesson and went over this in quite a bit of detail because this comes up often. How to coordinate pull-offs with the thumb. And in this particular case, in bar 2, he's talking about where it goes. So here's bar 1. And then bar 2 starts. And this is something... So we've got a pinch, the lick is going, and it's just 1 and 2 and. So 4/8 notes in a row, 4. And then the bass is going, right? So, and then you get 2 bass notes for free on beats of 3 and 4. So we got a pinch, and then you go to play 1st fret on the B string. I guess I should hold down the chord so you can see it. I'm holding down middle finger on the 2nd fret of the 4th string. And so this is the tricky thing, is you've got to coordinate the pull-off from the end of 1 to the downbeat of 2, that moment, with the bass note on the downbeat of 2. So in super slow motion, you've got pinch, pick, pull off while the thumb plays, and then index finger on the 3rd string. So let's just first look at the pull off, right? So you want to you're pulling off, literally pulling, you're plucking the string with your left hand, with your fretting finger, your index finger, and you're going to pull a little bit to the side while you keep your finger pressed to the wood of the fingerboard. So you're not going to just lift it off because you don't get any sound out of that, or not much. You want to pull to the side, and while you're pulling, you want to keep your finger pressed to the fingerboard till you feel a little bit of tension. The string should be sort of pulling back against your finger so that when you let go, you're actually plucking the string. And so you want to first see if you can make sound with the pull off. Don't worry about hearing the extra note on top. There'll be plenty else going on to drown that out. But you want to just work on this pull off to get that sound. And then you want to coordinate it with the thumb. So can you pluck the thumb and pull with the index finger on the other hand and get both notes? And so then can you do, pick the note, which is on the end of one, and then do the bass and the pull off. You're just going to do that a bunch of times. And then you're going to add the pinch on the downbeat. Sorry, we should have been doing that. We should have been doing that thumb on the fourth string, because that's where the bass would be. So, and then add in the last index note. So it's really this, and then putting everything in around it. All right, so that's a little bit about how to work on that for Paul. And Johnny, I think I answered your question already about playing over the last 4 bars. Correct me if I did not. I'm going to get to this question of Steve's in a minute, but first I'm going to look at the feed. And I think there were some other questions. Okay, this is all just about the freeze. Okay, so this looks like the main question, except for some, yes, my secret is out. I do not stream in short pants. Okay, John MacArthur. I'm interested in resources to learn licks that can be built into the arrangement. I'm okay with the shorter call response, but it's those long passages that are so mind-blowingly good and difficult for me to replicate. Okay, so I was thinking about this last night because, yes. So to answer Tim's question further up, yes, the TrueFire session is going to be, I think they're going to turn it into a class that you can, like a downloadable thing with everybody's lessons. But a lot of what I've spent time on besides fingerstyle has been that sort of improvisation that's on the border between blues and jazz. And so knowing how to play a phrase that goes, right, just ridiculous, but like a longer phrase that's all 8th notes, that's chromatic, that's got those bluesy phrases and those jazzier elements. That comes from, not from listening to fingerstyle guitar players, but from listening to people who play swing and jazz. And so it's all very modular. If you want to learn it, there's kind of like anything, there's kind of 2 ways in. There's the intellectual, and I don't mean that as a pejorative way. Like you can think your way through it. You can go, okay, well, I've got chord tones, and I've got scale tones, and I've got the notes that connect them up chromatically. So chord tones first, then scale tones connect the chord tones, and then chromatic notes connect the whole steps in the scale. And so you can just start to use those as building blocks. When you're on a chord, your first choice is a chord tone, your next choice is a scale step to connect up chord tones, and your choice after that is a chromatic tone to connect scale tones together. And so you can just start to assemble stuff. If you've got C, here's some C chord tones. Right, 5th, 3rd, root, 5th. Scale step, right? Because there's the 2nd of the scale. And there's the 6th, and then there's a chromatic note. There's a chromatic step. 7, there's the 6. So you can just start to sort of assemble them, the licks, or the opposite way to do it, and they're complementary, of course, but the opposite way is to go listen to people who play those kinds of licks. If you want to start with guitar players, go listen to some Charlie Christian. Get the records with the Benny Goodman Sextet and listen to some of the Charlie Christian solos. They'll be in funny keys like A flat and B flat and F. But he's a very intuitive, guitaristic sounding jazz guitar player. And so you'll hear the guitar notes going by, the guitar shapes. You'll be able to see that he's playing a B flat chord, or you'll be able to see the E flat 9 shape. And you can then take those licks and go, well, can that fit on the guitar? Oh yeah. It's a little tricky, but there's a way to get some of that in there. But now now the ninth is not just an intellectual idea. Now the ninth is a sound that someone like Charlie Christian plays. So now you can go back to your first approach, which is just mechanically like trying to find possibilities and go, well, 9 and 7 sound good, and this little climb up from the 5 to the 6 to the 7 sounds good, and this flat 7 to the 3 is nice. And you can sort of start to absorb the rhythm and the phrasing of what he's doing. You can start to find some licks that way. So developing a vocabulary is about listening and transcribing, and then also kind of moving things around on your own. And those two things exist on a continuum. I was, by inclination, tended, when I was starting to improvise, to just kind of look for my own things, but then realized, if I really want to know, if I really want to be able to play in an idiom or sound like people that I like, then you do have to spend some time trying to figure some of that stuff out from recordings or from watching people do it live or whatever you have access to. That is just a place to start. I'm going to look at your question again and just kind of see if that answered it. The longer phrases are really just accumulations of short ideas kind of put together. So you can also, if the short ideas make sense, then a lot of times you can just start trying to string them together in a little more detail. I'm not sure if that completely answers the question, but it's a good question and something we can talk about more going forward. So here is the last question that I've planned to get to, and this is from Steve, and it's kind of a nice segue. Asking about my perspective on my own learning and playing experience, moving through milestones from basics to learning notes on the fretboard, to learning the major and minor scales, to the application of theory, and then finally applying theory to improvisation and arranging. Well, these are milestones, and the relationship between them is not linear. I was fortunate in that certain things, like just grabbing chords and the logic of how chords move around on the neck, kind of made a certain intuitive sense to me from the beginning. Like, if that's a D7 and you slide it up, then, well, of course it's going to be an E7, and then that's going to be an A7. Like, that just sort of, I don't know, the guitar, that sort of made sense. But I didn't know what these notes were, and I didn't know that this was the fifth and the flat 7 and the third, and I certainly didn't know that this was and I got to stop and think about it. I didn't know this was an A and a G and a C sharp. I'm thinking E chords, but this is actually an A7 chord. So, that kind of information came from kind of pouring it into my own head grain by grain. There is a relationship between knowing where you are, the names of the notes on the fretboard, and being able to improvise. But what's more useful to me has been understanding the relationship between the intervals that you're playing. And by that I mean, if I grab this shape, I'm not, as you can tell from what just happened, I'm not thinking E and G and C sharp. I'm thinking 5th, flat 7, and 3rd. Which means if I want the 9th, I know the 9th is just below the 3rd here. And if I want the 6th, it's right below the 7th. And if I want, the flat 9, then I want to be here with the root so that I can raise the root a half step to the flat 9. And that is really valuable because it doesn't matter what key you're in. If you start to associate those pitches with melodies, then there starts to be a process of back and forth between the chords and the intervals and the melodies you hear. So I don't have to learn the song Caravan in the original key to know that those are the notes I want, because after playing on the guitar and then hearing melodies and then noticing the relationship between chords and melodies, oh yeah, it's obviously like a root flat 9 kind of thing. And so what are the other notes around that? That's a bluesy phrase. It's always that's always 5th, root, flat 7, and root. And that sound is always the major third of the flat 9. Those sounds become true. Doesn't matter where you are. So if this is your root, then all that stuff's going to happen around it because there's a triad. Or if you're here, there's your root on that shape. Or if you're, I don't know, so the relationship between the intervals and the chord become important. And as you grab chord shapes or triads around the neck, it's being able to sort of taste, it's weird, but like sort of feel, and it's this very sort of like multi-dimensional thing of like, this chord means major, and within major, the root, the 5th, and the 3rd all have a certain flavor, and the 3rd is the one that you do that to, and the 5th is the one you do that to, and then you can do that to it. And, I think if I was trying to learn this stuff and someone put it to me that way, I'd be really frustrated because it doesn't really explain how it happens. But, so I can try to give some concrete things around it too. But I do know that there is a point at which, here's the way you can start to put this stuff in your head concretely, all right? And it is this. Basically, you want to know the fingerboard, you can basically start to look at it by going up one string and saying, okay, this is an A. And there's only 7 notes in music, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And all the notes are only a half step or a whole step apart from each other. So let's go up the A string and find the notes. Here's A, here's B. We know that because that's the root of a B7 chord. Here's C, the root of a C chord. Here's D, we know that because, tuning the guitar. Here's E, it's an octave from the low string. Here's F, and we know that because when we're down here, it's a half step to F, so if this is E, this must be a half step. Here's G, we know that because we know when we get to the 12th fret, we're back to the original string, so that's got to be A, and G is a whole step below A. So, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, and coming back down is always harder. A, G, F, E, D, C, B, A. But now we know all the natural notes, all the white keys, all the no sharps or flats notes on the A string. And so, can you do it on the D string? Well, that's the root of a D chord, so that's got to be D. There's the octave of E again. There's F. F's always a half step up from E. Here's G, like tuning the guitar. Here's A, that's the octave of that note. Here's B. B is always a whole step up from A. Here's C, just because, there's a C bar chord, so that's one way to think about it. And 12th fret is always the same thing as the starting note. So D, E, F, G, A, B, C, So I'm naming the notes as I go, and that's the thing. I'm not going to play the note till I can say what it is. And this was excruciating. Like, this was slow. And I did it for each string. And then when I knew all the strings, I added one sharp because I'm like, well, I want to know the notes of a G scale. So I'm going to add a sharp in. So then all the F's became F sharps. E, F sharp, G, A, B, C, D, E. A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G, A, and so on. And so you do that and you can start to know the names of the notes on the fingerboard. And then at the same time, you can start taking shapes. You can go through those dominant dozen chords that we went over a million years ago. They're in the core content. But you can take 3-note chord shapes, triads. Like, just pick a key. I'm doing it in D. And you can name the notes if you want. A, D, F sharp, D, F sharp, A, F sharp, A, D. You can go backwards, going down the neck. D, A, F sharp, A, F sharp, D, F sharp, D, A. You can go from the middle out. D, A, F sharp, D, A, blah, blah, blah. Any way you can think of to turn them around. And then you can also do the intervals. 5th, root, 3rd, root, 3rd, 5th, 3rd, 5th, root, root, 5th, 3rd, 5th, 3rd, root, 3rd, root, 5th. When you start to know that kind of stuff, once you know the triads, you're home free. Because if you know the triads, if you know root, 3rd, and 5th, if you can grab a shape, look, how many shapes are there? There's these 3 for major triads, and there's these 3. And for improvising, that's kind of game over. You just need those 6 shapes for major. And then the minor ones are just one note different. Right? And then the 7ths, same thing. You don't even have one here. I guess there's one more when you do that. But, once you know the triads, you know where all the other notes are on the scale. The 6th is always a whole step above the 5th. The major 7th is always a half step below the root. The 2nd is right above the root, and the 4th is right above the 3rd. So if you can play a triad, you don't need to learn 5 positions of 2 octaves of major scales in every key. Just learn your triads. Once you know your triads, that's the key, man. You can get everything from those triads. You want a minor scale. You want a mode. You want Dorian. Make sure it has a major 7th, a major 6th, but a flat 7. Flat 3rd. That's it. You don't have to be like, you're never going to use that. It takes too much time to grab. You find triads, you can find chord tones, you can find scale steps. You're done. That's my advice. Okay. I see one more question, and I see it's right about 3 o'clock. So, okay. Question, do I still have plans to start up the composition workshop this year? That's a good question. There was not, the few people that were into that were really into doing it, but hardly anybody was that interested. So I'm not sure if I will do that or not. I do have some other course material in the works. I'm mostly, the way I see it, like, the fingerstyle 5 is kind of the ongoing thing. That's like, how do you learn new tunes? How do you practice? How do you learn to improvise? That feels really central to me. But I know that sometimes questions like this come up, and so I'm working on some kind of more fundamental stuff that's just about, like, getting Travis picking a steady bass together, learning the fingerboard, and basic theory. Like, those are some things that are kind of like, they're all, in my head, they're like the prequels. Like, this is the stuff you need to know to do this. Right. And then on the back end, there are a few more advanced topics that feel like they're a little too complicated to do here in the membership. Like, they kind of deserve their own space to work on them. And so I've got a couple ideas about that. And I guess if I thought the composition ones, that's sort of in the back of my mind for that kind of more advanced slot in the curriculum. But I haven't felt like there was a overwhelming groundswell of interest in it. I think the word composition is kind of intimidating. So I thought about changing the name of the class to How to Make Stuff Up on Guitar, because that's maybe a little more what it feels like when you do it. But I'll be interested to hear if there is interest in something like that, and it would certainly prompt me to get on the ball with making something like that happen if folks still wanted to work on it. So that is the story. I will just play for a couple minutes, and if there are any other questions, I will be glad to go into a little bit of overtime. But right now, I'll just play for a couple minutes, and then if there's nothing else, then we'll wrap it up for now. Good. A couple more questions. Awesome. Yes. What's our next tune? Can I tease the next month's song? And composition workshop would be great. Advanced topics. Yeah, I would get more specific, but I can't remember what they are. I had this list going, and I'd kind of gotten it down to the 2 or 3 that I thought were the most interesting. And I'm blanking. Pretty silly, but maybe it'll come to me. I will answer these other questions. And yes, could I do something? And this one from Henriette. Could I do something about singing while playing? Somewhere in your next month's lessons, playing while singing is much more an answer, I think, to the singing. If you get my drift, playing while singing. Yeah. Okay. So let me answer all of these because there's sort of an answer to all of these in what's coming up. And another rag at some point. Okay, so this is really interesting to me. I almost didn't do Trifecta Rag because I thought it might be, I knew that people had asked for a rag, and I knew sort of what people meant by a rag, and I knew that to some people, a rag might be too far afield from blues, like steady bass and, like Muddy Waters or whatever it is people think of as blues. And I know that's kind of not how most people who take these lessons think about it, but I know some people do. So, and then, there's, when the month that the Trifecta Rag came out, there were a bunch of people who had to leave the membership for whatever reason. And I know there's like a lot going on in the world, so I didn't take it personally. But I was like, oh my God, like I broke everybody. This tune was like too weird or too hard or too different. But then, there's been a handful of people who've been really vocal about how much they like doing it. And so here's Richard asking for another rag. So in the end, I feel like it was kind of good, and I feel like anything we can do to kind of widen the scope of what is fingerstyle blues is a good thing. And also because we had started off this particular 6 months since April with a couple of really classic blues tunes with Baby Please Don't Go and Sitting on Top of the World. I did want to kind of go a little bit outside that box. But here's what's, as of now, I always hesitate to say what's coming up because while I've got it sort of mostly worked out, sometimes I get in there and I'm like, this is going to be too this or too that or too much like something else we did. But as kind of a counterweight to doing a rag, we're going to do a steady bass blues. We're going to go back to some blues in E next month because there's always more to talk about in terms of improvising and chord forms, and it's going to be a steady. The fundamental version is going to be a steady bass. But the embellished version is going to have some walking bass. And there's some, even in the fundamental version, there's like some syncopated seventh licks. And then it's got kind of a different turnaround. And it's got an outro vamp. So it's actually a 16-bar tune. So it's got some different form things going on. I wanted to do another E blues, but not have it be too much like Solstice, basically, which was from the first 6 months. And if you joined in April, you can go back and check that out too. It'll have some more licks. So next month we'll do this coming month, July. We'll do blues in E, this sort of variation on the blues in E, and then there were a lot of requests to talk about St. James Infirmary, and I don't think we've done an A minor thing in a while, if at all. I'm trying to remember. The trick with St. James Infirmary is I have to listen to a few different versions and check and see. The melody, as I've always played it, gets out of open position. And I always want to make sure the fundamental version is approachable. So that's kind of, I'm looking at how to get, I'm actually working on that arrangement right now and trying to get that worked out. The blues in E is already like, basically, mostly, it's almost all shot and ready to go. And so then the 6th month, at the end of the first 6 months, we did something I called I can't remember, it was like a month to catch up, or, a lot of people had said like they were still kind of working on arrangements from a month or two before, and everybody felt like, it seemed like everybody needed a little extra time. So the 6th month, we did 5 arrangements, 1 a month, and then the 6th month, there was no real new tune in the sense that it wasn't a weekly set of assignments, but I did post some etudes, it was basically like, if you need this month to catch up. If you feel like you still want something to work on, here's some tunes. You can just learn these tunes. And they were kind of about the level of they were about the level of the fingerstyle blues factory that I did for True Fire or something like that. They weren't super hard, but they had some cool little moves in them, I thought, and they were in different keys and they gave you something to work on. I was thinking that at the end of this 6-month cycle, we could have a similar kind of period to catch up, and maybe I would do some special topics, right? So maybe do a couple of live streams. And one of them I was thinking, because there had been a few questions about playing and singing, so I was thinking maybe you do a live stream about that, maybe do a live stream about putting tunes together yourself. Hadn't really got that all figured out yet. Just the idea that we'd have some time to catch up, but it'd be a chance to kind of weigh in and address some of these other things. So as far as the question about singing and playing, that's something that we'll probably get to after the next couple tunes as like I said, a special topic. Maybe touch a little bit on the composition thing as a special topic, just to see who's interested in that and get some ideas for how to talk about that. And that would be, you wouldn't have to work on that if you had plenty to work on already. But that's sort of a forecast of what's coming. So probably we'll do St. James in A minor with an alternating thumb. And you can keep it to some pretty simple chords. chords really, but then right. So yeah, I guess, well, obviously we did do one A minor. We did the very first tune at the beginning of last September. We did House of the Rising Sun. You can't get more definitively A minor than that, right? But so this would be a chance to do another one. So that's kind of what's going on coming forward. And usually registration is wouldn't be open again until like late September, but it's the summer, and I always get like some emails like, oh, can I join now? So I might do like just a short, like 48-hour, like if you want to join in the middle of the summer, you can. So if you know anybody who you think might want to do it, or that is interested, I'll post a link, and people can maybe jump in the middle if they want to. I kind of like having everybody on like this 6-month thing, because then I kind of know like, okay, everybody's kind of got the idea, everybody kind of knows what's going on and how everything works, and I can kind of I don't have to explain it like twice a year, like how it works and what to expect. But like I said, I've gotten some emails about when is it going to be open again, so I may just do that in a couple of weeks. But it'll be just like a little short window for that. So that is what is going on. Good questions, and happy to sort of forecast what's coming up. So if there is nothing else, I'm glad that the live stream basically worked this time with only one big glitch, because I think they're a lot of fun. So thanks for being here, and new tune will post should post next Wednesday, and we'll be off and running on the next thing. So thanks for showing up, and if you're watching this after the fact, thanks for checking out, and see you next time.